Montana wind moves low across open ground, flattening the grass, and letting it rise again, like a chest breathing in and out. Far off, a ranch house sits low and long against the hills. Smoke curls from a single chimney, as though in all that country, only one place still dares to keep a fire lit. Closer. A woman stands at the crossroads. Black dress. Dust to her ankles. A wooden trunk at her feet, and nobody has come to meet her. She bends. Takes the handle. Lifts it with both hands, the cord standing out in her neck under skin that has weathered 58 years of sun. Then she walks. From behind the barns, a man's voice carries. Sharp. Cutting across the field like a whip finding its mark. Not built to be understood. Built to press down. She does not stop. Only tightens her grip on the handle. And walks straight toward it. The stagecoach dropped her at the crossroads. A half-mile from Cedar Hollow. Nobody came to meet her. She stood there. Trunk at her feet. Wind moving through the grass like something breathing, in and out, patient. Somewhere behind her the driver clicked his tongue. The horses pulled away. And then it was just her. Just the road. Just the ranch house sitting low and long against the far hills, smoke curling up from one chimney like it had nowhere else in the world to go. 58 years old. Widowed 2 years. Standing at a crossroads in Montana, with everything she owned packed into one trunk and one bag. She picked up the trunk. Started walking. Because that was what she did. She walked toward things. Even the things that scared her. Especially those. The house grew as she got closer. The way houses always did. Revealing themselves slow, piece by piece, and she found herself cataloging it, without meaning to. Good roof. New paint on the porch rail. Old paint everywhere else. A barn built by somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. And additions to that barn, built later, by somebody who did not. Money here. Spent carelessly. She could smell it the way she could smell rain coming an hour before the first drop fell. Old habit. Old skill. 20 years of keeping other people's books had given her that. The ability to walk onto a piece of land and hear the numbers underneath it before anyone ever handed her a single ledger. A man was shouting before she reached the yard. She heard him before she saw him. Voice cutting across the open ground like a whip finding its mark. Sharp. Deliberate. Built to travel. Built to be heard by every hand, within a quarter mile, because that was the whole point of a voice like that. Not communication. Domination. I don't care what the supplier said. Get those wagons moved, before noon or somebody's wages get docked for it. She rounded the corner of the barn. And there he was. Mid-50s. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who used to work, and had stopped some years back, and never quite noticed the stopping. Vest too fine for a working ranch. Boots too clean. The kind of clean that told her he hadn't walked through a single pasture in a long while, not really, not with his own 2 feet doing the walking. He saw her. Stopped mid-stride. Looked her over the way men like that always looked women over. Quick. Dismissive. Already deciding, before she'd said a single word, that she wasn't worth the rest of his attention. You'll be the bookkeeper. Not a question. She noticed that. Eleanor Wren. She set the trunk down. Offered nothing else. Roland Ashby. I run this operation. He didn't offer his hand. You'll report to me. Anything you find. Anything you question. Anything at all. It comes to me first. Not the hands. Not anybody else on this property. Me. Understood, she said. And she meant it the way she always meant things like that. Understood. Filed away. Not agreed to. There is a difference between the two words, and she had learned that difference the hard way, more than once, in more than one lifetime. She'd met men like Roland Ashby before. At the bank in Helena. The one that took her family's land 20 years back, with a smile, and a signature she still dreamed about some nights, still woke from, with her jaw clenched, so tight her teeth ached by morning. At the county assessor's office too, after Thomas died, where a clerk half her age had explained, patiently, gently, the way you'd explain something to a child, that her signature alone wasn't quite sufficient. Men who mistook volume for authority. Men who had never once in their whole lives been told no, and been made to sit with it. She knew exactly how to handle men like that. You let them talk. You wrote everything down. And you waited. He showed her to the office. Small room off the main house. Heavy desk. 2 cabinets. A window looking out, over pastureland going gold in the late afternoon light. And ledgers. Stacked floor to ceiling along the far wall. Years of them. Some still wearing a thin film of dust, that told her, plain as any signature, that nobody had opened them in a long, long while. Books are behind, Roland said from the doorway. That's why you're here. Get them current. Keep them tidy. A pause. His voice went flatter. Harder. Don't go digging into what isn't yours to dig into. He left without waiting for a response. Eleanor stood alone in the small office a long moment. Looked at the ledgers. Looked at the window. Looked at the door he'd just walked through. Then she pulled out the chair. Sat down. Opened the oldest ledger on the stack. And got to work. Because that was the thing about grief. About loss. About being handed a life you never asked for, and told, more or less, to go make something of it. You didn't sit with it. Sitting with it let it grow teeth. You worked through it instead. One column at a time. One number stacked carefully on top of another, until the numbers gave you something solid enough to stand on, when the rest of the ground gave way. She met him on her 3rd day. Almost didn't. Almost walked right past, without noticing, the way you walk past things, that turn out later to have changed everything. Which is, she would come to think, the way most important things arrive. Quietly. Sideways. Disguised as nothing at all. A young hand named Wyatt had mentioned, in passing, that the fencing records for the east pasture didn't line up with what she'd already cross-referenced in the supply ledger. So she went out to see the fence herself. Because numbers on a page were one thing. The truth in the dirt was another. And she'd learned a long time ago, the very hard way, not to trust the first, without checking the second. She was crouched by a broken post. Running her fingers along the wire gauge. When she heard someone working nearby. Steady rhythm. Unhurried. The particular cadence of a man, whose hands knew a task, so completely that his mind had wandered off somewhere else entirely, and left the hands to finish the job alone. She stood. Turned. He was maybe 60, though the years, and the sun had carved him, into something that made the number feel almost beside the point. Tall. Lean in the way of men who'd worked outdoors their whole lives, and never once fought it, never once resented the weather for what it took, from a man's skin. Gray at the temples. And his eyes, she noticed this, before she noticed anything else about him, were the color of creek water in late afternoon. Somewhere between green and gray. Depending on how the light caught them. He was driving a new post, into the ground, with a mallet. Hadn't looked up yet. "Excuse me," she said. "You wouldn't know who's been handling fence orders for the east section." He set the mallet down. Thought about it. That surprised her. Most men answered, before they'd even finished hearing the question, whether they knew the answer, or not, because answering fast felt like knowing. This one actually thought. Which told her something, before he'd said a single word. Used to be a man named Higgins, he said finally. Left back in the spring. Since then Ashby's been placing the orders himself. He looked down at the post he'd just set. Through a supplier out of Bozeman. Though I couldn't tell you the wire coming in matches what's on the invoice. Eleanor looked at the wire. She didn't know enough about fencing to judge the gauge, with her own eye. But she'd learned, over 20 years of bookkeeping, that when a man volunteered a detail like that without being asked twice, it was usually worth writing down. "I'm Eleanor Wren," she said. "The new bookkeeper. Nathaniel." He picked the mallet back up. Nathaniel Calloway. No last name offered like it should mean something to her. No pause built in for recognition. Just a name, given the way you'd give directions to a stranger passing through, and then he went right back to his work like the conversation had already run its natural course, and there was no sense stretching it past that. She walked back to the office thinking, simply, that he was the most thoughtful ranch hand she'd met in a long while. She would think about that thought later. How wrong it had been. How completely, almost comically wrong. The first week folded into the second. The second folded into the third, the way weeks do, when a person is working hard enough not to feel the weeks passing. Eleanor fell into the rhythm of Cedar Hollow the way she fell into every new place. Quietly. Completely. Eyes open, opinions held close, until she understood what she was actually looking at. That had always been her way. Watch first. Talk later. Maybe never talk at all, if talking wasn't going to change anything. And what she was looking at, she came to realize, was a ranch running on two systems at once. Layered one over the other. Like a photograph exposed twice by accident, and never corrected. On the surface, Roland ran everything. He gave the orders. Set the schedule. Decided which cattle went where, which supplier got, which contract, which hand got which assignment. He sat at the head of the table in the cookhouse, before anyone else, so much as touched their plate. Though as far as Eleanor could tell there was no rule requiring it. He simply did it. And everyone let him. But underneath that surface. Something else entirely. When a young hand went missing half a day, and turned up 3 miles out, with a sprained ankle, and a lame horse, nobody sent word to Roland's office. Wyatt ran straight to find Nathaniel instead, and 20 minutes later Nathaniel rode out, with a spare horse, and a field kit, calm as a man fetching water, from a well he'd drawn, from 1,000 times before. When a delivery came up 2 crates short, and the cook stood in the yard ready to put somebody's head clean, through a wall, over it, she didn't march to Roland's office either. She found Nathaniel wherever he happened to be working that day. Said her piece. Walked away satisfied, without Eleanor ever once learning what exactly had been said in return. When old Silas Boone came down, with a fever bad enough to keep him in his bunk 5 straight days, it was Nathaniel who sent for the ranch doctor. Nathaniel who made sure Silas's wages kept coming, fever or no fever, work or no work. Roland never mentioned any of it. Not once. Not a single time. Eleanor noticed all of it. Because noticing was, in the end, the only skill she had ever fully trusted. She asked Wyatt about it one afternoon, while he hauled feed sacks toward the horse pens. Who exactly is Nathaniel? Wyatt's face did something careful. Something blank, in a way, that told her more than any words would have. The particular expression of a man, who had been taught, directly or through hard experience, not to answer certain questions out loud, not to anybody, not even to a woman, who seemed kind enough. One of the hands, he said. Been here a long while. He seems to carry a lot of weight, for a hand. He's good at what he does. And Wyatt went back to his feed sacks like the conversation had ended itself, and there was no point either of them trying to revive it. By the end of her 4th week, Eleanor had developed a habit. Evenings, when the ledger work started giving her that particular ache behind the eyes, not from difficulty, but from concentration, from holding too many columns in her head at once, until the numbers began to hum, she walked down to the creek along the western edge of the property. She didn't go there to think about the numbers. She went there to stop thinking about them. For an hour. Sometimes 2. Nathaniel was there the first time. Sitting on a flat rock. Boots off. Feet in the water. Reading something she couldn't quite make out in the fading light. She almost turned back. Didn't want to intrude on a man's quiet, because quiet, she'd learned, was worth respecting the same way a locked door was worth respecting. But he heard her, before she'd decided, and looked up. "Room on the rock," he said. No ceremony to it. Just an offer. Plain as the water itself. She sat. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The creek moved. Somewhere upstream a bird called once, and went silent again, and Eleanor found something in the not talking, that she hadn't realized, until that exact moment, she'd been missing for 2 long years. "How are you finding the work?" he asked eventually. "Interesting." That's not what most people say about bookkeeping. Most bookkeepers aren't paying attention. He looked at her then. Quick. Something behind it she couldn't quite name. "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose they are." They talked the better part of an hour. About the rhythms of a ranching year. About beef prices in Chicago, and what that meant for a Montana operation 3 seasons out. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that he knew things a fence hand had no particular reason to know. Not just the practical mechanics of the work, but the shape underneath it. The margin between a profitable season and a ruinous one. The way a drought 2 counties over could shift prices here, months later, the way a stone dropped in still water sends its ring outward long, after the splash is forgotten by everybody standing on the bank. She found herself telling him about Thomas. Hadn't planned to. Hadn't told a soul at Cedar Hollow about her husband. About the pneumonia, that took him quick, and without warning 2 winters back. About the debts, that followed, quiet at first, and then not quiet at all. About the year she'd spent clawing her way out, from under them, 1 column at a time, the way she'd clawed her way, through most of the hard things in her life. But something about the near dark. And the water moving. And a man, who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. It opened something in her she'd kept carefully shut. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said when she finished. Not the automatic sorry people offer, when they don't know what else to say, and want the subject changed, as fast as decency allows. The kind that meant he'd actually heard her. Every word of it. She came back to the creek the next evening. And the one after that. Just to talk. Except it wasn't just to talk. And some small honest part of her knew, that even then, even as she told herself otherwise on the walk back to the house each night. It was Wyatt, who gave her the first real warning. Though she didn't recognize it, as one at the time. She was working late. Cross-referencing supply invoices against the delivery logs. When he knocked on the open door frame. "Miss Wren." He stopped. Looked at the ledgers spread across her desk like they might bite him. "I just wanted to say." He stopped again. "Say what, Wyatt?" "Be careful what you tell Ashby. About what you're finding in there." She set her pen down. "Why?" His jaw worked. "Ashby doesn't care for questions about money. Especially not from." He stopped a 3rd time. "From women," Eleanor said. Flat. Not a question. From anybody who isn't him. He left before she could ask anything more, and she sat, with that sentence a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over a column that wouldn't balance. Then she went back to work. Because that was the thing. She'd already found something. Had found it 3 days earlier, actually, and had been circling it ever since, the way a person circles a wound, before they finally make themselves look at it straight on. A discrepancy in the current quarter's cattle sale figures. Not a rounding error. Not the kind of small honest mistake a tired clerk makes on a long afternoon. A gap between the number of heads sold at auction in Bozeman and the amount that had actually come back into the ranch's account. $1,200. In a single quarter. She'd added the column 3 times. Same answer, 3 times running. She closed the ledger that night without saying anything to anyone. Told herself she needed more information first. Needed certainty before she opened her mouth to a single soul at Cedar Hollow. That was the reason she gave herself. The real reason, the one she didn't look at directly, not yet, was fear. Not fear of Roland exactly. Fear of what it would cost her to be right about this, in a place where she was still new. Still unproven. Still the widow brought in from outside who didn't fully understand how things worked here. Which meant if she was wrong, she'd lose the position. Lose the income she needed to rebuild a life already knocked flat once. And if she was right? If she was right, she might lose those things anyway. Because being right here meant accusing the man who ran this ranch, in front of everyone, of something serious. And Roland Ashby had already made it clear, in his slick, unhurried way, that he did not care for being questioned. Not by hands. Not by women. Not by anyone at all. She carried that number around with her for a week. $1,200, sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down no matter how many times she told her hands to open. She was sitting at the creek one evening, watching the water, when Nathaniel finally noticed. "You've been somewhere else all week," he said, without looking up from the book in his hands. She almost said it was nothing. The word was halfway to her mouth before she redirected it, because she was tired. Genuinely, bone-deep tired. Of carrying the thing alone. "I've found some irregularities," she said. "In the accounts." He set the book down. Turned to face her fully. Not alarmed. Not immediately curious either. Just present, the way he always seemed to be present, like the whole rest of the world had gone quiet on purpose to make room for whatever she said next. What kind of irregularities? The kind that aren't mistakes. She said it plainly. No hedging. The way she'd always stated a fact once the fact was clear enough to stand on its own 2 legs. He was quiet a long moment. "How long have you been carrying that by yourself?" "A week. Maybe longer." "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Her voice didn't shake. She was almost proud of that. "I've been certain since the 3rd time I added the same column and got the same number." He nodded. Once. Not like a man surprised. Like a man absorbing a piece of information he already intended to do something about, filing it away somewhere he'd built for exactly this purpose. "Don't say anything to Ashby," he said. "I know that much. Don't say anything to anyone. Not yet. Not until you have all of it." He paused. "Every invoice. Every discrepancy. Every date, every figure. So when it comes out." "When," she repeated. Not if. She'd noticed that. "When it comes out," he said again, steady, "there's no room left for anyone to argue with it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something underneath, that certainty that struck her as more settled than she'd have expected from a man who mended fences for a living. She filed it away. Didn't ask. Not yet. "All right," she said instead. They sat with the water a while longer. "Thank you," she said finally. He picked his book back up. "You'd have found your way to it on your own," he said. "You only needed to say it out loud to somebody." She walked back to the house, that night with something moving in her chest she hadn't felt in longer than she cared to admit. Not since before Thomas died. Before the farm. Before any of it. She felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she wasn't carrying the weight of things entirely alone. The following Monday she came in before sunrise. Pulled the oldest ledger off the stack. The one from years back, still carrying the faint dry smell of whoever had kept it, before her, a name she'd seen written in the margins, but whose fate nobody at Cedar Hollow seemed willing to discuss out loud. She began at the beginning. By noon she'd filled 6 pages of her own notebook, with dates and figures. By late afternoon she'd traced 3 separate patterns. And each one was more deliberate than the last. The first was simple. Inflated supplier invoices. The difference quietly pocketed. The second was subtler. Cattle sales recorded at a lower price than the auction records showed. A skimming so careful it would have taken someone, who genuinely loved numbers, someone who read a ledger the way other people read letters, from home, to notice the seams at all. And the third. The third made her set her pen down. Press both hands flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. Because the third pattern reached back 3 years. And it wasn't $1,200. It was so much larger than that. She sat there along, while in the fading light. Not moving. The number sitting in her chest like something, with teeth of its own. She thought about Wyatt's careful blank face. About Silas Boone, sick in his bunk, who would have gone, without wages if Nathaniel hadn't quietly stepped in. She thought about every hand on this ranch who'd ever walked past Roland's office door, with their eyes cast down at their own boots. Then she picked up her notebook. Tucked it into the front of her dress. And went to find him. She found him, where she usually found him this late in the day, not at the bunkhouse, not at the cookhouse, but out near the small outbuilding west of the main barn, mending tack with the same focused quiet, that never seemed to need anyone else's company to feel complete. He looked up when he heard her coming. Whatever he saw in her face made him set the leather down, and stand immediately. "I found it," she said. "All of it. Enough of it, anyway." She stopped in front of him. "Nathaniel. This has been going on for years. Roland's been running this, hiding it in layers, but I can prove it. All of it." He didn't say anything at first. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. Fully. Without rushing past what she'd said to get to his own response. "Are you frightened?" he asked. The question was, so direct it caught her off guard. "Yes," she said. "Good. Quiet. Certain. Frightened means you understand exactly what you're dealing with." A pause. "Do you trust what you found?" "Completely." "Then we're going to deal with it." Something settled across his face then. Something old and patient, that she didn't yet have a name for. "Starting tomorrow," he said. "What happens tomorrow?" He looked at her, and for one fraction of a second there was something behind his eyes she couldn't read. Something that looked, almost, like the answer to a question she hadn't thought to ask yet. "Tomorrow I stop letting him think nobody's watching," he said. "I want you to bring me every page you've got, first thing, before Ashby's even had his coffee. I want to see it laid out plain, with my own eyes, the way you built it. That's all tomorrow is. One good hard look at the truth, between the two of us, before either of us decides what to do with it. Are you going to tell me why that matters so much to a fence hand?" He picked the tack back up. Went back to his work, like the conversation had reached its natural edge, and there was no sense pushing past it tonight. "Get some sleep, Eleanor," he said. "You've done good work today." She stood there a moment longer, watching him, and something in her, the part of her, that had spent 20 years learning to read a room by the numbers underneath it, told her there was a great deal more sitting beneath this man than a fence hand's quiet competence. She didn't ask. Not yet. She walked back toward the main house in the settling dark, her notebook pressed flat against her ribs, and she didn't yet know that her whole understanding of Cedar Hollow, of Roland, of the numbers, of the quiet man by the creek, was about to come apart at the seams, before the week was out. She only knew, walking through that dark, that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't carrying the weight of it alone. Behind her, Nathaniel Calloway sat very still in the last of the light. The tack forgotten in his hands. And his face, had anyone been there to see it, was not the face of a man, who mended fences, and waited his turn at the supper table. It was the face of a man, who had spent 30 years being careful. And who understood, sitting there in the dark, with the creek moving past him, that being careful was about to cost him something he hadn't fully reckoned with until this exact moment. She didn't sleep. She told herself she would. Lay down on the narrow bed in the small room off the east wing. Closed her eyes. Tried to let the day's exhaustion pull her under the way exhaustion usually did. Except her mind kept moving. Not because she doubted the numbers, she trusted them completely, the way she trusted very little else in this life, but because numbers, once you understood what they were telling you, had a way of demanding your full attention whether you wanted to give it or not. She lay in the dark, and ran the figures again. And again. Until the arithmetic sat in her chest like a stone too heavy to set down. Until the first gray light showed at the edges of the curtain. And she finally gave up on sleep entirely. She rose. Dressed. Went back to the office, before the rest of the ranch had stirred. The ledgers were where she'd left them. Her notebook, too. The silence of the early morning made every small sound, the scratch of her pen, the turn of a page, feel enormous. The way silence always feels right, before something breaks. She worked 2 hours, before the cookhouse came alive down the yard. By the time the smell of coffee reached her window she'd added 4 more pages, and found 2 discrepancies she'd missed the day before. Her hands stayed steady. That surprised her a little. She'd expected them to shake. Nathaniel came by at 7, before Roland was even up, and stood in the doorway looking at the stack of documentation she'd built. "You did all this overnight," he said. "I didn't sleep. I can see that." Something in his voice went careful. "You don't have to carry the weight of proving it alone, Eleanor. Not from here on." "I know that now," she said. "But I needed it right the first time. Once was going to be enough. I've been wrong about people trusting the truth before. I wasn't going to give this man a single loose thread to pull." He looked at the pages a long while. Then at her. "You're not going to be wrong this time," he said. He left before Roland's boots ever hit the porch steps, and Eleanor understood, watching him go, that whatever tomorrow had meant to him the night before, he'd already spent it. Quietly. Before the rest of the ranch had even opened its eyes. Roland came to the office at 8 sharp, the way he always did. Not because he had business there, she'd come to understand, but because presenting himself, regularly, in every corner of the ranch, was part of how he kept the sense, that everything ran, through him and nothing moved, without his knowledge. He stopped in the doorway. Looked at the ledgers spread across her desk. "Early start," he said. "There's a great deal to get through." A pause. She could feel him reading the room the way men like Roland always read a room, hunting for the particular quality of alertness, that would tell him whether she knew something he'd rather she didn't. She kept her face still. Her eyes on the page. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "Nothing I can't account for." The lie came out smooth. Flat. No edges for him to catch on. She'd never been a natural liar. Thomas used to tease her about it. Said her face gave away every hand she'd ever held. But she'd learned something in the 2 years, since his death, sitting across from bank clerks, with their sympathetic faces, and their quiet redirections. There was a particular kind of truth-withholding, that wasn't quite lying. It was simply choosing what to give, and what to hold in reserve. And holding it with absolute steadiness. For the first time, since she'd arrived, he crossed the room fully, and lowered himself, into the chair across, from her desk. The same chair, she would remember later, that would matter again, before this was through. He sat there a moment, elbows on his knees, studying her with something, that wasn't quite suspicion, yet but was building toward it. "You work harder than the last one did," he said. "Higgins?" He didn't answer that directly. Just watched her a beat too long, then stood, and the chair creaked once behind him, as he rose. "Good," he said. And left. She waited until his boots had faded down the porch steps, before she let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then she turned back to the page. And began again. Because that was the only way through it. One column at a time. Until the truth had nowhere left to hide. Something shifted in the ranch's rhythm by that afternoon. Though it took her a while to name exactly what. Wyatt brought her coffee around 9, and lingered longer than usual. Not saying anything in particular, just present in the way people are present, when they're quietly checking on someone, without wanting to say so out loud. Mrs. Hargrove, the cook, a solid, weathered woman with the general warmth of a fence post, appeared at the office door around 10, with a plate of biscuits she had no earthly reason to bring, set them on the corner of the desk, without a word, and left. Eleanor ate one of the biscuits. Thought about that for a long while. She thought about the way Silas Boone had looked at her the week before, passing near the barn. Not unfriendly. Measuring. The way a man looks at somebody he's trying to decide whether he can trust. These people knew something was wrong at Cedar Hollow. They'd known for a long time. And whatever quiet, unspoken test they'd been running on her, the way communities, that live together long enough will test a newcomer, without ever formally agreeing to do so, she had, apparently, been passing it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was sure it mattered. She found Nathaniel at the creek again that evening. And this time she didn't wait for the ritual of settling in, before she started talking. "People here know about Roland," she said, sitting without preamble. Not the specifics. He wasn't reading tonight. Just watching the water, which she'd come to understand was what he did, when something weighed on him. But they know. They've known a long while. Then why hasn't anyone said anything? He was quiet. Not the quiet of a man avoiding the question. The quiet of a man choosing how to answer it honestly. Because knowing something, and being able to prove it are two different animals, he said. And because Roland's been careful. Not smart, exactly. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. But careful. He's made sure the people, with the most to say have the most to lose. How do you mean? One man's been told, if he talks, the back wages owed him disappear. Another borrowed money, from Roland 2 years back, when his wife took sick. Another's nephew needed a letter of reference. He paused. Roland doesn't threaten people, Eleanor. He collects them. Quietly. One at a time. She sat with that. That's not someone who stumbled into wrongdoing, she said slowly. That's someone who planned it. Yes. How do you know all this? He looked at her then. That same look, from the first evening, the one she'd once mistaken for simple thoughtfulness in a fence hand, and was only now beginning to suspect went a great deal deeper than that. People talk to me, he said. Why? I don't know. A pause. Maybe because I don't repeat what I hear. Maybe because I ask instead of order. Another pause, longer this time. Maybe because people can usually tell, when somebody actually gives a damn about the answer. She looked at the water a long while. "Do you," she asked finally, "actually give a damn about the people on this ranch?" "Yes." No hesitation at all. She believed him. Believed him the way she believed her own ledgers. Not because she wanted to, not because it made anything easier, but because every piece of evidence pointed the same direction, and she'd never once in her life been able to look away from evidence simply because the conclusion was inconvenient. It was 2 mornings later that the first real crack opened. She'd gone back to the oldest ledger, the one from 4 years past, cross-referencing supplier names against county land records almost as an afterthought. A habit more than a plan. The way a careful bookkeeper double-checks a column even after it's already balanced twice. And that was when she saw it. A name on an old invoice. Signature at the bottom, cramped and slanted in a particular way. The kind of handwriting a man doesn't fully control no matter how hard he tries to disguise it. She sat very still. Because she knew that handwriting. Had known it for 20 years, though the name beside it here was different from the name she remembered. She'd seen that exact slant. That exact pressure on the downstroke of the letter S. On a document that had taken her father's farm out from under him when she was a young woman, with a new husband, and a whole life still ahead of her that hadn't yet been rearranged by other people's greed. Her hands went cold before her mind had even finished the thought. No, she told herself. Impossible. 20 years. Different state. Different name entirely. Except handwriting didn't change the way a man's face changed. Didn't age the way skin aged. Except she'd sat, with that old signature for months back then, staring at it in lamplight, trying to will it into meaning something other than what it meant. And some things burn themselves into memory so deep that 20 years doesn't touch them at all. She pulled the invoice closer. Held it up to the window light. Which was foolish, she told herself, because light didn't change ink. Light only made a thing easier to see clearly, and clarity was exactly what she was afraid of right now. Because if she was right, then this wasn't only about missing cattle receipts and inflated invoices. This was personal. This had always, somehow, without her knowing it, been personal. She sat there a long while. The old invoice trembling faintly in her hand. And somewhere outside her window the ordinary sounds of the ranch went on without her. A dog barking. A wagon wheel creaking. Mrs. Hargrove calling something to Wyatt across the yard. The whole ordinary world moving forward, while she sat frozen over a piece of paper 20 years, and several hundred miles away from where it should have been. She needed to be certain. Not frightened certain. Not the kind of certain that comes from an old wound reopening in the dark. The kind of certain that comes from evidence laid out clean and undeniable, the way she'd built every other conclusion in her life. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She went back to work. She worked 3 straight days, without going to the creek. Because she couldn't. Because sitting across from Nathaniel with that signature burning a hole through the lining of her dress felt like a betrayal of something she hadn't even named yet. So she stayed in the office. Stayed with the ledgers. Stayed with the cold, careful, methodical work of building something so solid that no one, not Roland, not a lawyer, not God himself, could argue it away. She cross-referenced. She traced. She built columns of dates against columns of names against columns of dollar amounts, until her own handwriting started to blur in front of her, and she had to set the pen down, and press her palms flat against her eyes just to make the room stop tilting. 20 years. 20 years, and a signature could still do this to her. Could still reach up out of an old ledger like a hand out of the dark, and take hold of her chest and squeeze. She thought of her father. The way his face had gone slack, when the bank man laid that document down on the kitchen table, calm as you please, and said the words that ended everything they'd built. She thought of her mother's hands shaking around a coffee cup that never once made it to her mouth. She thought of Thomas, years later, holding her while she cried about a farm that had already been gone a decade, saying, quiet and steady, the only kind of comfort that had ever fully worked on her, "We'll build something new, we don't need what they took." And now here she was. 58 years old. In a strange man's office. Looking at a signature that might belong to the same devil who'd done it to her the first time. Except that couldn't be right. Except it could. Except the mind does strange things, when grief gets old enough to go quiet, and then something pokes it awake again, and Eleanor had learned, the hard way, the only way anybody learns it, not to trust her own certainty, when her chest was doing this particular kind of pounding. So she went back to the numbers. Because numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't carry old grudges dressed up as new discoveries. Numbers were, in the end, the one thing in this world Eleanor Wren had never once had reason to doubt. On the fourth evening she finally went to the creek. Not because the fear had passed. Because she couldn't carry it by herself one more night, without it eating clean through her. He was there. Of course he was there. Sitting on the rock same, as always, boots off, book closed in his lap like he'd stopped reading some time ago, and simply hadn't moved since. He looked up. And whatever he saw in her face made him set the book down, without a word. "Sit," he said. Soft. Not an order. An offering. She sat. The water moved between them along, while before either of them spoke. "I found something," she said finally. "Something that isn't about the ranch." "Not exactly." "Tell me." "There's a signature. On an old invoice. From 4 years back." Her voice wanted to shake, and she wouldn't let it. "I've seen that signature before, Nathaniel. 20 years ago. On a document that took my family's farm." He went very still. "You're certain?" "I don't know." The words came out ragged. More honest than she'd meant them to be. "That's the trouble. I don't know, if I'm certain, or if I've just gone looking for ghosts, because I'm tired, and frightened and this whole thing has cracked something open in me I thought I'd sealed shut years ago." "What was the name?" he asked. "On the old document." "Not Ashby. Something else. A man calling himself Rhys Doyle." She looked at the water. "But the hand, Nathaniel. The slant. The way the S drags at the end like he can't quite commit to finishing it. I'd know that signature blind." He was quiet a long moment. "Then we find out," he said. "Properly. Not with fear. With facts." "How?" "There are county records in Bozeman. Land transfer filings. If a man named Rhys Doyle defrauded your family 20 years back, there'll be a paper trail, with his hand on it somewhere, that isn't 20 years old, and isn't sitting in your memory doing all the work by itself." She looked at him. "You'd help me chase a ghost, from my own life, that has nothing to do with this ranch?" "It has everything to do with this ranch," he said. Quiet. "Certain?" "If I'm right about what you found in those invoices, Eleanor, it has everything to do with all of us." She didn't understand what he meant by that. Not yet. She would. It was 2 days later that the second crack opened. And this one didn't come from an old ledger. It came from the land itself. She'd taken to writing the fence lines in the mornings now, the way Nathaniel did, because something in her wanted to see the actual dirt behind every number, before she trusted the number itself. She was out past the north pasture, following the irrigation channel that ran down off the ridge toward the lower fields, when she noticed the gate. A wooden gate. Iron latch. New enough that the wood hadn't grayed yet, which struck her as strange, because nothing else out here was new. And a small metal plate bolted to the post beside it. stamped with a name she didn't recognize. Voss Water Holdings. She stood there a long moment. Looked at the channel. Looked at the gate. Looked at the way the water, which should have run straight down, into Cedar Hollow's lower fields the way it had for 30 years by every account she'd read, instead diverted here, through this gate, under this stranger's name, before it ever reached the ranch at all. Her stomach went cold. Because a man, who owns a supplier contract can skim off invoices. Can pocket a few $100s a quarter, and hope nobody, with a sharp enough eye ever comes looking. But a man who controls the water. A man who controls the water controls everything downstream of it. Every acre of grazing land. Every head of cattle that needs to drink. Every single thing this ranch was built to be, all of it, held in one man's hand like a stone he could squeeze whenever he pleased. She rode back faster than she'd ridden anywhere in years. She found Nathaniel mending a section of fence near the barn, same as always, same unhurried rhythm, like the whole world hadn't just tilted sideways under her feet. "There's a gate," she said, before she'd even swung down off the horse. "North Channel. Iron latch, new wood. A plate with a name on it. Voss Water Holdings." He went still in a way she'd started to recognize now. The particular stillness of a man absorbing something, and deciding, in real time, how much of his reaction he was willing to let show. How much of the flow is going through it? I don't know irrigation well enough to say for certain. But it looked like most of it, Nathaniel. It looked like the water meant to reach your lower fields is being routed somewhere else, before it ever gets here. "Show me." They rode out together, and the whole way there Eleanor's mind ran ahead of her, turning the pieces, because that was what her mind did with pieces. It turned them, until they either fit, or broke apart entirely in her hands. Which meant this wasn't only theft. This was a slow strangulation. A man skimming cattle receipts could be caught, and stopped in an afternoon. But a man diverting water, a man patiently starving a ranch's lower pastures season after season until the herd had to shrink, and the shrinking herd meant less income, and less income meant debts, and debts meant a ranch eventually had no choice at all, but to sell. That wasn't a thief. That was a siege. They reached the gate. Nathaniel dismounted slow, walked the length of the channel, with his jaw set tight, and when he crouched down at the diversion point, and saw exactly how the flow had been redirected, something moved across his face, that Eleanor had never once seen there before. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. Something that had been waiting a long time to finally have a shape to attach itself to. "How long has this been here?" she asked. The woods knew. 6 months, maybe less. He stood. Looked out over the lower fields, gone thinner and browner than they should have been this deep into summer. "But the pattern isn't new, Eleanor. I've watched this grass thin out 2 years running, and told myself it was drought. Told myself it was bad luck." His voice went low. "It wasn't luck. Who is Voss?" "Harlan Voss." He said the name like something bitter held too long on the tongue. "Landman out of Bozeman. Buys up water rights and mineral claims around struggling operations, waits for them to weaken, and makes an offer nobody in their right mind refuses, because by the time he makes it there's no other way out left standing for the family holding it. And Roland. Roland doesn't have the standing to arrange something like this on his own," Nathaniel said. "A county water filing needs an owner's signature. Or a very convincing forgery of one." He looked at her. "Which means either somebody forged my name onto a document I never signed. Or somebody with legal standing on this property signed it for me, and made very sure I never found out." Eleanor felt the ground shift under that sentence the way it had shifted under the signature 4 days earlier. "Nathaniel," she said slowly. "How would a man forge the signature of the owner of Cedar Hollow, without the owner finding out for 2 full years?" He didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed, in the particular way he wouldn't meet her eyes for one full breath. Eleanor Wren, who had spent 20 years reading rooms the way other people read newspapers, understood, with a clarity that landed in her chest like a dropped stone, that she had been asking the wrong question the entire time. "Nathaniel," she said again, quieter now. "Who owns Cedar Hollow?" The silence went on a beat too long. "I do," he said. 2 words. She stood there in the thinning grass, with the water running wrong beside her, and the sun going low, over hills that, apparently, this man in a worn jacket and dirt-creased hands had owned this entire time, and she felt something in her chest do a strange, dropping thing that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite betrayal, and wasn't quite anything she had a ready name for. "Say that again," she said. Slowly. "I own this ranch." His voice was steady. Low. The voice of a man laying something down, that he'd carried a long while and was finally setting on the table between them. "Have for 30 years. Inherited it from my father, when I was 32. You've been sleeping in the bunkhouse." "Yes." "You fix fences." "Yes." "You let Roland Ashby order you around this ranch like a hired hand for." She stopped. Did the arithmetic, without meaning to, the way she did arithmetic on everything. 30 years, Nathaniel? Not 30 of being ordered around, he said. 30 of choosing to stay quiet about who I am. There's a difference. I know it doesn't look like much of one, from where you're standing right now. Explain it to me. Because right now it looks exactly like a man, who let me talk about my dead husband on that rock while he sat there knowing a great deal more about his own ranch than he ever once let on. Something crossed his face at that. Something that looked, for the first time, since she'd known him, close to pain. "When my father died I was 32 years old, he said. Inherited everything. Hired the best manager money could find. Good references. Good name." His jaw tightened. "Took me 6 months to understand what happens to a man once everyone around him knows he owns the ground they're standing on. Every answer changes. Every problem disappears the moment you walk into the room. Because nobody wants to be the one who brought a problem to the man who signs their pay. So you disappeared instead. So I stopped announcing myself." His voice had gone rougher now, like something long buried finally coming up for air. "Hired a manager to be the face of it. Stayed in the background. Worked the fence line, ate at the long table, let people believe what they already assumed. And I heard things that way, Eleanor. Saw things. Understood this ranch in a way I never could have, from behind a desk, with my own name carved into the door. And Roland. Roland was supposed to be the face of it. Run the day-to-day. His eyes went hard. I trusted him. 30 years, and I trusted him completely. You were wrong. I was wrong." The evening moved around them. Somewhere behind them a horse stamped, and shifted, and the water kept running wrong beside them, patient, indifferent, the way water always was to the wars fought over it. "How long have you known something was wrong?" she asked, with the books. "Suspected, 2 years." He looked at the diversion gate like it had personally wronged him. "But suspecting isn't proving, Eleanor. Roland knew my habits. Knew I preferred to stay in the background. He used that against me. Kept everything just uncertain enough, that I never had clean ground to stand on, when I tried to act. Until I came. Until you came." He turned to look at her fully now, and something in his face had gone very open, very unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "And didn't know enough, yet to be careful about what you found." She stood with that a long moment. The weight of it. 30 years of a man building distance between himself and everyone around him, because the one time he'd let himself be known, it had cost him. Cost him in ways she was only beginning to understand. And underneath the weight of it, something else. Something she didn't want to feel right now, not with her chest still raw, from the water gate, and the signature, and 4 days of one revelation stacking on top of the next. Because she had told this man about Thomas. Had told him things she hadn't told another living soul at Cedar Hollow, on the strength of believing he was simply a quiet fence hand, with more sense than most men carried. And he had let her. Every evening. Knowing the whole time exactly what he was. "You let me think you were nobody," she said, and her voice cracked in a way she hadn't given it permission to do. "I let you think I was a hand on this ranch," he said. "I never once let you think I was nobody, Eleanor. Not for a single evening. That's a very careful distinction. I'm a very careful man." He held her gaze. "It's the only way I know how to survive being what I am." She looked away first. Looked at the water instead, running wrong through a gate, with a stranger's name bolted to the post. "I need time," she said. "With this. I know. Not the ranch. Not the theft." Her jaw was tight now. "The rest of it." "I know," he said again. And the way he said it, steady, patient, without a trace of pushing for more than she'd offered, was, infuriatingly, exactly the kind of thing that made it harder for her to stay, as angry as she wanted to be. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the light thinning to a pale copper along the ridgeline, and Eleanor spent the whole ride turning 2 facts over in her hands like stones she couldn't set down. That the man she had told her deepest griefs to, on a rock beside a creek, believing him to be nobody in particular, was in fact the owner of everything around her. And that somewhere out past the county line, a landman named Harlan Voss was quietly starving this ranch to death 1 gallon of diverted water at a time. And Roland Ashby, steward, thief, and possibly, God help her, possibly the same man, who had ruined her family 20 years ago under a different name entirely, was standing at the center of it all, smiling at her over morning coffee like none of it had ever touched him. She didn't sleep again that night. But this time it wasn't grief keeping her up. It was work. The county records office in Bozeman was a 2-hour ride, and Eleanor made the trip, with Silas Boone driving the wagon, because Nathaniel had insisted someone go with her, and because Silas, old, weathered, carrying a stillness of his own, that she was only beginning to understand, had insisted it be him. "You knew Walter Higgins," she said, somewhere along the 2nd hour, when the silence between them had gone comfortable enough to break. Silas didn't answer right away. Kept his eyes on the road, hands loose and easy on the reins. "I did," he said finally. "He was the bookkeeper before me." "He was. What happened to him?" Silas was quiet a long while this time. Long enough that Eleanor thought he might not answer at all. "Walter found things," he said finally. "Same as you're finding. Maybe not as deep, not as fast, but he found the shape of it. Went to Ashby about a supplier discrepancy, thinking it was routine, thinking a good manager would want to know. And? Ashby told him it was being handled. Told him not to worry himself over it." Silas's jaw worked. "Told him he'd confirm it, with the owner personally." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He went to Nathaniel. Didn't know it was Nathaniel he was going to. Nobody knows unless Nathaniel decides they should." Silas shook his head slow. "Ashby brought the matter to Nathaniel dressed up, as something else entirely. Some minor confusion, nothing worth troubling over. Nathaniel told Walter it was handled, because that's what Ashby had told him to say, and Nathaniel didn't, yet know enough to smell what was underneath it. So Walter trusted the answer. Walter trusted the answer. Stopped digging." Silas's voice had gone flat in a way that told Eleanor exactly how much this had cost him to watch happen. 6 months later, Ashby found a reason to let him go. Some story about missing funds, that never quite held together, if you looked at it straight on, but nobody looked at it straight on, because by then Walter was gone, and there wasn't anybody left willing to ask the question out loud. Eleanor sat with, that a long moment, the wagon rattling steady, over the road, the hills rolling wide, and endless on either side. He used Nathaniel, she said slowly. Used his own arrangement, the hiding, the anonymity, against the very man it was meant to protect. That's about the shape of it. Does Nathaniel know that's what happened? That his silence got an innocent man fired? Silas glanced at her sideways. He knows now. Has for a while. Carries it the way he carries most things. A pause. Quiet. And heavy. Eleanor looked out at the road ahead, and something in her chest, already raw from days of one revelation stacking on the next, cracked open a little further. Because now she understood something about Nathaniel Calloway, that she hadn't understood standing at that water gate the evening before. His silence wasn't only a shield. It was a wound he'd been carrying, too. A mistake with a man's livelihood attached to it, and he'd lived, with that mistake for however long it had been, unable to undo it, unable even to fully explain it to anyone, because explaining it meant admitting who he really was. She thought about Walter Higgins somewhere out there, fired on a lie, his name quietly ruined, and she felt something harden in her chest alongside the grief. Because whatever happened next, whatever this cost her, and she suspected now, sitting in that wagon, with the dust rising behind them, that it was going to cost her a great deal, she was not going to let this ranch chew up one more honest person the way it had chewed up Walter Higgins. The county records office was a squat brick building on the edge of Bozeman, and the clerk, who helped her, a patient young man, with ink-stained fingers, and the particular thoroughness of someone, who took his filing cabinet seriously, pulled land transfer records going back 30 years, without so much as a raised eyebrow at her questions. She found what she was looking for in the second hour. A land transfer, 20 years back, filed in a county 3 states, from here but cross-referenced, through a regional banking record, that had, for reasons of bureaucratic tidiness she'd never fully understand, been duplicated into this office's archive. A farm. Her father's farm. Signed away under duress, under threat, under a scheme, so carefully built it had taken the family's lawyer 18 months to even understand what had happened to them. Signed by a man named Rhys Doyle. She held the document, with both hands, because one hand alone wasn't steady enough. And there it was. The signature. The particular drag at the end of the S, the way the pen lifted just slightly too soon on the downstroke, like the man behind it could never quite commit to finishing what he'd started. The same hand. The exact same hand, as the invoice sitting folded in her notebook back at Cedar Hollow. "Ma'am," the clerk's voice, gentle, from somewhere far away. "You've gone pale. Can I fetch you some water?" "I need one more record," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was, she supposed, the only skill that had ever truly mattered in this whole business. A physical description. Anything on file for a Rhys Doyle, filed with this transaction, or anywhere connected to it. The clerk disappeared, into the archive, and came back 20 minutes later, with a faded insurance affidavit, the kind attached to a bonded transaction, describing the signing party in the flat clinical language such documents always used. Height. Build. A small scar noted above the left eyebrow, sustained, the affidavit noted, with bureaucratic indifference, in a riding accident some years prior. Eleanor closed her eyes. Because she had seen that scar. Had seen it every single morning for weeks now, at 8 o'clock sharp, standing in her office doorway, asking her in his smooth unhurried voice whether she'd found anything interesting. She rode back to Cedar Hollow, with the document folded inside her notebook, pressed flat against her ribs the way she'd carried her own findings, that first terrible week, and the whole way home she said almost nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say, that the paper in her pocket hadn't already said for her. Roland Ashby. Rhys Doyle. The same man, 20 years and a false name apart, and both times, it turned out, doing precisely the same thing. Smiling at a family, with one hand, while the other hand quietly, patiently, took everything they had. She found Nathaniel at the barn, when she returned, and the look on her face must have told him everything, before she said a word, because he crossed the yard toward her faster than she'd ever seen him move. "Eleanor." "It's him," she said. The words came out thin, stretched over something enormous. "Roland. Rhys Doyle. The same man. Same signature, same scar, same everything. He's the man who took my family's farm 20 years ago." Her voice cracked clean, through on the last word. "He's been sitting across from me at breakfast every morning, smiling, asking after my accounts, and the whole time." She couldn't finish it. Nathaniel didn't say anything for a long moment. Just stood there in front of her, close, steady, the way a man stands, when words aren't going to be enough, and he knows it. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Quiet. And it was, she noticed even, through the fog of everything crashing down at once, the exact same kind of sorry he'd offered her, that first evening by the creek, when she told him about Thomas. The kind that meant he'd actually heard her. Actually understood the size of what she was carrying. 20 years, she said. 20 years I've wondered what became of him. Told myself it didn't matter anymore. Told myself I'd built a life past it. Her hands were shaking now, finally, after days of staying steady, through everything else. And he's been here the entire time. Under my own roof. Under yours. Then we finish this, Nathaniel said. Low. Certain. The same certainty she'd first heard in his voice at the creek, the night she told him what she'd found in the ledgers. Properly. Completely. Not just the water, not just the cattle receipts. All of it. Every year he's stolen, every family he's ruined to build whatever he's building with Voss. You believe me. I believed you, before you had the affidavit, he said. The affidavit just means nobody else gets to argue with us now. She looked at him a long moment, this man who owned everything around her, and had spent 30 years pretending he owned nothing, who had let her grieve beside him, without once revealing the size of what he was, who carried his own quiet failure, over Walter Higgins the way she carried her own, over every year she'd stayed silent out of fear. I'm still angry with you, she said. About the ranch. About the not telling me. I know. That doesn't go away just, because we've got bigger devils to fight right now. I know that too. His voice had gone soft in a way she hadn't heard from him before. I'm not asking it to go away, Eleanor. I'm asking you to let me stand next to you, while we finish this. The rest of it, we settle after. On its own terms. When there's room to. She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Because whatever else was true, whatever reckoning still waited for the two of them once this was over, right now there was a document in her notebook, that could bring down a man who'd already ruined one family of hers, and she was not for anything, not for old grief, not for wounded pride, going to let fear cost her the chance to finish what she'd started. That night, back in the small office, she laid every piece out on the desk in front of her the way she'd laid out the invoices weeks before. The signature. The affidavit. The water gate, with its stranger's name bolted to the post. The cattle receipts skimmed quarter after quarter for 3 years running. And underneath all of it, a single thread pulling everything together, patient and cold, as the water running the wrong direction, through that new iron gate. Roland Ashby hadn't simply been stealing from Cedar Hollow. He'd been building something. Slowly. Carefully. Starving the ranch's lower fields year by year, skimming just enough off the books to keep it looking like ordinary bad luck, working in step with a landman named Harlan Voss, who bought up the water rights of struggling operations the way other men collected debts owed to them. Which meant this wasn't only theft. This was a plan to take Cedar Hollow whole. Piece by piece, season by season, until Nathaniel had no choice left but to sell. She sat back from the desk, the lamp burning low, her eyes aching, from the strain of it, and she thought about her father's kitchen table 20 years ago. The bank man's calm voice laying out papers like he was doing them a favor. She thought about Walter Higgins, fired on a lie he never got the chance to fight. She thought about Silas Boone's careful, weathered silence, and Wyatt's blank guarded face, and Mrs. Hargrove's biscuit set down on her desk, without a word, every single person on this ranch quietly, wordlessly hoping somebody new would finally have the nerve to look, where they'd all been too frightened to look themselves. And she thought about Nathaniel, standing at that water gate, with his jaw set tight, 30 years of careful silence finally cracking under the weight of what it had cost him. She closed the ledger. Pressed both palms flat against her eyes. Because tomorrow, she knew, this was going to stop being something she carried quietly in a notebook. Tomorrow, or the day after, this was going to become something the whole county heard about. And Roland Ashby, Reese Doyle, whatever name he wore this season, was not, she suspected, going to go down, without trying to take somebody, with him on the way out. She just didn't yet know who. Roland moved first. That was the thing nobody had accounted for. Not Eleanor, not Nathaniel, not even Silas, with all his careful, weathered patience. They'd spent 4 days building their case in the quiet of that small office, laying document beside document, letting the truth stack itself up brick by brick. And Roland Ashby, it turned out, had been watching the whole time. She came into the office on a Tuesday morning, and found the ledgers rearranged. Small things. Things nobody but her would notice. A stack shifted 2 inches to the left. A ribbon marker moved, from page 40 to page 38. The kind of disturbance, that told her, cold and certain, that someone had been, through her desk in the night. She stood in the doorway a long moment. Didn't move. Because moving meant touching something, and touching something meant she couldn't say for certain later what had been there, and what hadn't. Which was, she would come to understand, within the hour, exactly the point. Roland found her there at 9 sharp. Didn't knock. Never knocked. Stood in the doorway, with his hands folded in front of him, and something in his face had changed overnight. The smoothness gone thin at the edges, like a man wearing a mask, that had started to slip, and knew it. "Miss Wren," he said. "I need you to come to my office. I have work here. It'll keep." His voice had an edge under it now, that hadn't been there the week before. "This won't." She followed him across the yard, and the whole walk her mind ran fast, and ugly with possibilities. Because a man, who moves first is a man who's decided he has nothing left to lose by moving. And that thought alone made her stomach drop clean, through the ground. His office was exactly, as deliberate as she remembered, from her first week. Good rug. Good desk. A mounted elk head, that had never once, she suspected, been anywhere near an actual hunt. He crossed to that same chair he'd sat in only days before, in her office, studying her, and lowered himself, into his own, behind the desk. Gestured at the chair across from him. She didn't sit. "Suit yourself," he said, and reached into a drawer, and set a folder on the desk between them. She looked at it. Didn't touch it. "Open it," he said. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents. Bank transfer records, or something built to look exactly like bank transfer records, showing funds moving out of the Cedar Hollow operating account, into an account bearing her own name. Eleanor Wren. Dates going back weeks, the entire length of her employment. Her stomach turned to ice. "What is this?" "That," Roland said, folding his hands on the desk, with a stillness that chilled her worse than shouting would have, "is evidence that you've been skimming this ranch's accounts since the week you arrived. Which I will be presenting to the county sheriff, and to Nathaniel Calloway, unless we come to an understanding right now, in this room, between the 2 of us." She felt the room tilt. Because this was forged. Had to be forged. She knew her own hand, her own accounts, knew there was no account anywhere in this territory bearing her name, that held a single dollar she hadn't earned honestly in 20 years of careful work. Except forged evidence, laid out clean, and official on official-looking paper, didn't care what she knew to be true. Except a man determined enough could make truth look like whatever shape he needed it to be, and she had learned that lesson once already, 20 years ago, at a kitchen table, with a different name attached to the same devil. "You did this," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her hands, which had gone cold, and unsteady in a way she despised. "The same way you did it to a family in another state, under another name, 20 years ago." Something flickered behind his eyes. Just a flicker. Gone before she could be fully certain she'd seen it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Rhys Doyle." The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. He didn't move. Didn't blink. But something underneath his stillness went very, very tight, the way a rope goes tight right before it snaps. "Careful," Roland said finally, quiet now, quieter than she'd ever heard him. "You're standing in a room, with a man, who has spent 20 years learning exactly how to make an inconvenient woman disappear, from a ledger. I would think very hard, Miss Wren, about which of us the county is more likely to believe. The steward who's run this operation for a decade. Or the new bookkeeper, weeks in the door, with a forged bank record already sitting on my desk, with her name on it. You think that frightens me? I think it should. It doesn't." And to her own considerable surprise, it was true. Something had hardened in her over these past weeks, something that had started the day she opened that first ledger, and refused to look away from what it told her, and had grown harder still, with every discovery since. "I've already lost a farm to a man exactly like you. I built a whole life back up out of nothing after that. You don't have anything left to threaten me with that I haven't already survived once." Roland's jaw tightened. "Then you leave me no choice," he said, and reached for the folder, closed it slow, deliberate. "This goes to the sheriff by Friday. And to Nathaniel." A pause, and something almost like satisfaction crept into his voice. "I wonder how much he'll believe you, once he's looking at bank records, with your own name printed clean across the top." "He'll believe me. Will he?" Roland's smile was thin now, cold. "You've known that man only a matter of weeks, Miss Wren. I've had 30 years of his trust. Let's see which one of us that actually counts for, when it matters." She walked out of that office with her spine straight, and her pulse hammering, and she didn't let either of those things show, until she'd rounded the corner, into the hallway, and was fully out of his sight. Then she stopped. Pressed a hand flat against the wall. Breathed. Because he was right about one thing, and it terrified her more than the forged documents did. A handful of weeks was not 30 years. And if Roland Ashby had spent 3 decades learning how to make an inconvenient truth disappear, he had learned, somewhere in that same span, exactly how to make an inconvenient woman's word count for nothing at all. She found Nathaniel at the barn, and she didn't wait for him to notice her coming. She crossed the yard fast, faster than dignity allowed, and he was already turning, before she'd said a single word, some old instinct in him reading trouble in the way she moved. "Eleanor. Roland has forged bank records," she said, and the words tumbled out of her too fast, too tangled, because there wasn't time to lay this out slow and careful the way she usually laid things out. "Records showing funds moving into an account under my name. He's threatening to take it to the sheriff. To you. By Friday." Nathaniel's face went very still. "Show me." "I don't have it." He kept it. "It's his evidence, Nathaniel, built to look exactly official enough, that anybody glancing at it would believe every word." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and she hated that it did. "He as good as told me. 30 years of his word against a handful of weeks of mine. And he's not wrong to think that matters. It doesn't matter to me. It'll matter to a sheriff. To a judge. To anyone who doesn't already. She stopped. Made herself breathe. To anyone who doesn't already know me the way you do. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment, and something in his face had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen before. Not at her. Past her. At whatever Roland Ashby had built himself, into over 30 careful years in this man's shadow. Then we don't give him, until Friday, he said. We move tonight. Move how? We have the water gate. The old invoices. The affidavit. She shook her head, and the panic she'd been holding down all morning finally broke loose at the edges. It's not enough, Nathaniel. Not against 30 years of trust and a forged bank record, with my name printed on it. We need more, and we need it, before Friday, and I don't know, where in God's name we're supposed to find it in 3 days. Silas will know. Know what? Where the rest of it's buried. Nathaniel was already moving, already calling out across the yard for someone to fetch the wagon, and something in his stride now had none of the careful, unhurried quality she'd come to associate with him. This was a different man entirely. A man who had spent 30 years choosing invisibility, and had, in the space of one morning, run clean out of patience for it. Nathaniel. He stopped. Turned back. If this goes wrong, she said, if we can't prove it in time. It won't go wrong. You don't know that. No, he said, and something moved across his face, that was almost, in the middle of everything, close to gentle. But I know you. And I know what you've built in weeks, that took most men on this ranch 30 years to see clearly. That's not nothing, Eleanor. That's not a handful of weeks against 30 years. That's the truth against a lie, and the truth has a way of outlasting whoever's telling it. They found Silas in the tack room, working leather the way he always worked leather, slow and steady, like the whole world hadn't just tipped sideways around him. He listened to what Eleanor told him without interrupting. Didn't move, didn't flinch, just absorbed it the way a man absorbs bad weather he's been expecting for a long while. There's a strongbox, he said finally. Buried behind the old smokehouse. Walter Higgins showed it to me, before he left. Copies of everything he'd found, before Ashby got to him. Told me to keep it safe. Told me somebody might need it someday. Eleanor felt something rise in her chest, that was almost too large to hold. You've had it this whole time? Wasn't mine to hand over. Silas's jaw worked. Not until somebody proved they could carry it, without getting themselves run off the way Walter got run off. You've proved that, Miss Wren. These past weeks. A pause. Wasn't sure anybody would again. They dug it up, that night, by lantern light, the three of them working in silence behind the smokehouse, while the rest of the ranch slept, and when Silas finally pried the lid loose, and Eleanor got her first look at what Walter Higgins had left buried in the dirt for however many years, she understood, all at once, the true size of what they were standing in the middle of. Not simply skimmed cattle receipts. Not simply a diverted water channel. A ledger of its own, kept separate, careful, in a silenced man's hand. Names. Dates. A record of every family in the county Harlan Voss had quietly starved into selling over the past decade, with Roland Ashby's fingerprints, in one form or another, on every single transaction. Cedar Hollow wasn't the first. It wasn't even close to the first. Dear God, Eleanor said, very quietly, holding the pages up to the lantern light, with hands that had finally, after everything, started to shake. This isn't a scheme, Nathaniel. This is a machine. He's been doing this for years, across half the county, and nobody's ever once connected all the pieces, because he never let any one family see more than their own piece of it. Until now, Nathaniel said. Until now, she echoed, and something in her chest, alongside the fear, alongside the fury, was beginning, very quietly, to feel something else entirely. Something that felt, cautiously, dangerously, like hope. The next morning brought a letter. Not from Roland. From the county clerk's office in Bozeman, the very office Eleanor had visited days before, informing all water rights holders along the northern channel of an emergency hearing, called by petition, to review a disputed diversion filing. Called, the letter noted, by one Harlan Voss. Eleanor read it twice at the breakfast table, and the second time through, understanding landed cold and clear. "He's moving too," she said. "Voss. He's forcing the hearing before we're ready. Before we've had time to build the case properly." Or, Nathaniel said, reading over her shoulder, his voice gone tight, "He doesn't know we've found anything at all. He thinks this is routine. A formality to legitimize a filing he already believes is settled. Which means if we show up to that hearing with nothing but suspicion and a folder full of accusations, we lose," Nathaniel finished. "In front of the entire county. On the record, permanent, the kind of loss that doesn't get a second try." Eleanor set the letter down. Looked at the wall calendar Mrs. Hargrove kept nailed by the pantry door. 3 days. 3 days to turn a silenced man's buried ledger, and a mother's 20-year-old grief, into something a county hearing officer couldn't argue away. Because that was the arithmetic now. Not cattle and invoices and water gates. A woman's whole reckoning, with the man who'd broken her family once already, laid out in front of strangers, weighed against 30 years of another man's careful reputation. She looked up at Nathaniel. "Then we'd better get to work," she said. "Because I did not survive losing everything once just to lose it again on account of running out of time." The 3 days that followed blurred together in a way Eleanor would never fully untangle afterward, even years later, even when she tried. She worked the way she'd worked, that first terrible week in the office. Sun up to well past dark, ink staining her fingers, eyes burning, refusing to let herself stop even, when her hand cramped, so badly she had to switch, which fingers gripped the pen. Silas rode between Cedar Hollow and 3 neighboring ranches, quietly gathering statements from families whose names appeared in Walter's buried ledger. Families who had, until this week, believed their own losses were simply bad luck, bad seasons, nobody's fault but the land's. They were not, it turned out, difficult to convince otherwise. Because grief recognizes grief. Because a rancher, who lost half his herd to a mysteriously dry season 3 years back doesn't need much convincing once somebody lays a diversion map in front of him, and shows him exactly where his water had actually gone. Wyatt rode messages between properties at a pace that left 2 horses lathered and blowing by the second day. Mrs. Hargrove kept coffee coming at all hours, and said almost nothing, though Eleanor noticed, once, the older woman standing in the office doorway a long while, looking at the growing stack of testimony on the desk, before she finally spoke. "My sister lost her place to Voss," Mrs. Hargrove said. "Flat. Quiet. 6 years back. Told everybody it was the drought." She set down a fresh pot of coffee. "Wasn't the drought." Eleanor looked up. Would she testify? At the hearing? Mrs. Hargrove's jaw tightened. She would now. And Nathaniel worked harder than any of them, in his own quiet way, riding to Bozeman himself to secure the affidavit records properly, notarized, unimpeachable, the kind of paper that couldn't later be argued away, as a grieving woman's memory playing tricks on her. He came back on the evening of the second day looking like a man who hadn't slept in longer than he'd admit to, and he found Eleanor still at the desk, still working, and he stood in the doorway a long moment, before she noticed him. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "I will. After." He came in. Set a folder on the desk beside her stack. The notary confirmed everything. The affidavit, the description, the scar. "It's clean, Eleanor. Airtight." A pause. "You did this." Found the thread, and pulled it, until the whole thing came apart in your hands. We did this. You found it first. His voice had gone soft in a way that made her chest ache, tired as she was, raw as everything in her felt, after 2 days of barely sleeping. I spent 30 years walking past pieces of this, and never once put them together, because I was so busy being careful nobody saw who I was, that I stopped seeing what was happening right in front of me. Nathaniel. I'm not finished. He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair Roland had once occupied in this very room, and something about that mirroring struck her, sharp and strange, in the middle of everything else. I've had 30 years of practice at disappearing. You've had a handful of weeks of practice at looking hard at things nobody else wanted looked at. And somehow yours turned out to matter more than mine, in the end. She looked at him a long moment. Exhaustion sat heavy behind her eyes, and underneath the exhaustion, something else, something that had been building slow and quiet since that first evening on the rock, since before she'd known his name meant anything beyond itself. I'm still angry with you, she said. About the not telling me. I told you that already, and it hasn't gone away just because we're 3 days from a hearing that could take everything from both of us. I know. But I don't think I could have done any of this without you standing beside me while I did it. Her voice caught, just slightly. And I don't fully know what to do with both of those things being true at once. You don't have to know, Nathaniel said. Not tonight. Tonight we finish the work. The rest of it can wait until there's room to breathe again. She nodded. Picked the pen back up. And they worked, side by side, until the lamp burned low, and the whole ranch had gone dark and silent around them, 2 people building a case out of grief and stubbornness and 30 years of careful watching, because that was, in the end, the only thing either of them had ever really known how to do, when the world handed them something too large to carry alone. The morning of the hearing came in gray and cold, the kind of Montana morning that made a man's breath show even indoors, and Eleanor dressed, with hands that would not fully stop shaking no matter how many times she told them to. Because this was it. Because 3 days of buried ledgers, and hurried testimony, and a notary's careful stamp had all been building toward this single morning, and if it went wrong, if Roland's 30 years outweighed her handful of weeks the way he'd promised her it would, there would be no second chance at any of it. She found Nathaniel in the yard, already dressed, already saddled, standing very still, and looking out at the hills the way a man looks at something he's afraid he's about to lose. Ready? He asked, when she reached him. No, she said honestly. But we're going anyway. Something that might have been a smile, thin and tired, crossed his face. That's usually how the important things get done. The county hearing room in Bozeman was larger than Eleanor had expected. Long benches. A raised platform at the front, where a hearing officer sat flanked by 2 clerks. And along the side wall, a scattering of chairs already filling, with faces Eleanor recognized from Silas's 3 days of riding. Ranchers. Widows. A weathered man, who turned out to be Mrs. Hargrove's brother-in-law, sitting beside his wife, with his hat crushed in both hands. And near the front, seated with the easy confidence of a man, who believed this morning was already settled in his favor, sat Harlan Voss. He was younger than Eleanor had pictured. Clean-shaven, well-dressed, the kind of polish that came from money rather than land. And beside him sat Roland Ashby. Their eyes met across the room, just for a moment, and Eleanor watched something flicker across Roland's face. Surprise, first. Then something colder, calculating, as he took in the folder under her arm, and the row of unfamiliar ranch families filling the side benches behind her. He hadn't expected this many people. He hadn't expected her, ready, 3 days after his forged bank records should have frightened her into silence. The hearing officer called the proceeding to order, and the first hour moved slow, procedural, Voss's lawyer laying out the water filing in the dry official language such things always wore, arguing the diversion was a legitimate transfer, properly signed, properly filed, nothing here worth the county's time. Then the hearing officer turned to the room. "Are there any parties wishing to contest this filing?" Eleanor stood before she'd fully decided to. "I do," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was, she thought distantly, the only skill that had ever truly mattered in any of this. "On behalf of Cedar Hollow Ranch. And on behalf of several other families in this county, who have discovered, in the past 3 days, that their own losses were not bad luck at all." A murmur moved through the room. Roland's lawyer rose immediately. "Objection. This woman has no standing." "She has every standing," Nathaniel said, rising beside her, and his voice, when it came, filled that room the way she'd never heard it fill anything before. Not loud, never loud, but carrying, absolute, the voice of a man, who had spent 30 years choosing not to be heard, and had finally, completely, run out of reasons to keep choosing it. "My name is Nathaniel Calloway. I am the owner of Cedar Hollow Ranch. And this woman is my bookkeeper, who in a matter of weeks uncovered what the rest of us failed to see in 30 years. The room went very quiet. Voss's easy confidence flickered, just slightly, and beside him, Roland's face had gone the color of old ash. "Owner," the hearing officer repeated slowly. "The filing before this board lists Roland Ashby as the authorized signatory for Cedar Hollow's water rights." "Then the filing is fraudulent," Nathaniel said, "because I never signed it, and I never authorized Mr. Ashby to sign it on my behalf." Voss's lawyer tried again. "That's a serious accusation without proof." Eleanor stepped forward, and she set the folder down on the small table, before the hearing officer's platform, hands finally steady, because there was no room left in her chest for fear now, only for the work. "I have proof, sir. I have a signature, matched exactly, between an invoice filed at Cedar Hollow 4 years ago, and a land transfer filed in another state 20 years ago, in which a man calling himself Reese Doyle defrauded my family of our farm." Her voice held. "Barely. That man sits in this room right now, under the name Roland Ashby." The murmur in the room rose, into something louder. "I also have a notarized statement," she continued, before anyone could interrupt her again, detailing a pattern of water diversion, invoice manipulation, and falsified cattle receipts spanning 3 years at Cedar Hollow alone. "And I have sworn statements, from 4 other families in this county," she gestured to the row behind her, and every face there sat up a little straighter under the weight of being named, each of whom lost land, water, or livestock to arrangements brokered by Mr. Voss, and facilitated, in every single case, by Mr. Ashby. The hearing officer's expression had gone very sharp now, very focused, and he leaned forward, looking not at Eleanor, but past her, at the row of ranch families sitting grim and silent along the side wall. "Is this true?" he asked them directly. "All of you?" One by one, they nodded. Mrs. Hargrove's brother-in-law stood, hat still crushed in both hands, and his voice, when it came, shook badly but held. "Lost near half our herd 3 years back. Told ourselves it was the drought. Wasn't the drought." He looked at Voss. Didn't look away. "Was him." Roland shot to his feet. "This is a coordinated attack on my character, and I won't stand here and—" "Sit down," Nathaniel said. 2 words. Quiet. The exact same 2 words she remembered him saying in her mind, though she'd never actually heard him say them before, the same certainty she'd sensed under his calm for weeks now, finally given voice in a room full of strangers. And Roland Ashby, who had spent 30 years never once being told no by anyone on Cedar Hollow's ground, sat down. The hearing officer called a recess to review the documentation, and the room broke into a low, urgent murmur the moment he left the platform, Voss's lawyer already leaning toward his client, voices sharp and hushed, while Roland sat very still, staring straight ahead, his jaw working like a man chewing on something he couldn't swallow, and couldn't spit out either. Eleanor sat back down beside Nathaniel, and her hands, finally, after 3 days of forcing them steady, began to shake. "You did that," Nathaniel said quietly. "We did that." "No." He looked at her, and his eyes had gone soft in a way that undid something in her chest she'd been holding rigid for days. "I stood up, and said a name I've been hiding for 30 years. That took me 30 seconds, once you'd already done the hard part. You built this, Eleanor. Every piece of it." She didn't have an answer for that. Just sat there, shaking, in a cold hearing room in Bozeman, and let herself, for one moment, feel the full weight of what the last weeks had cost her, and given her both. The recess lasted the better part of an hour. When the hearing officer returned, his face had gone grim in a way that told the room everything, before he said a single word. "The board finds sufficient cause," he said, "to refer this matter to the county sheriff for full criminal investigation. The water filing in question is suspended, effective immediately, pending review. Mr. Voss and Mr. Ashby are hereby ordered to remain within county jurisdiction until this matter is resolved." The room broke into sound. Relief. Disbelief. Somewhere behind her a woman crying quietly, into her husband's shoulder. And through all of it Eleanor sat very still, watching Roland Ashby's face, as the full weight of it finally landed on him. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked, for the first time, since she'd met him, like a man who had run entirely out of road. He tried, once, on his way out of the building, flanked by a deputy who'd arrived faster than Eleanor would have thought possible, to catch her eye. "You think this ends it," he said, low, just for her. "You think one hearing undoes 30 years of knowing how this county actually works?" "No," Eleanor said, and she found, to her own surprise, that her voice held no fear in it at all now, only something clean, and cold and finished. "I think it starts it. There's a difference, and you're about to spend a great deal of time learning what it is." He didn't answer. Just looked at her a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes, that might have been, at the very end, something close to recognition. The look of a man realizing, 20 years too late, that the woman he'd once ruined at a kitchen table had grown into exactly the kind of person he should have feared finding again. Then the deputy led him out, and Harlan Voss, after him, and the hearing room doors closed behind them both, and Eleanor Wren stood in a cold building in Bozeman, Montana, and let herself breathe for what felt like the first time in 3 days. The ride back to Cedar Hollow took 2 hours, and for most of it neither of them spoke, the wagon rattling steady, over the road, and Eleanor found herself, somewhere in the second hour, simply watching Nathaniel's hands on the reins, steady now, the tension that had gripped his shoulders for 3 days finally beginning to ease. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. "To the ranch." "To all of it." "The water gets restored," he said. "That happens first. Lawyers sort the rest. Restitution, the criminal proceedings, whatever comes of Voss's other dealings once the sheriff starts pulling threads." He glanced at her. "It'll take months. Maybe longer." "And Cedar Hollow?" "Cedar Hollow's going to be fine." Something in his voice had gone quieter now, more careful, the way a man's voice goes quiet right before he says something that matters more than the words around it usually carry. "Better than fine, I think. For the first time in longer than I want to admit." She looked out at the hills a while longer. "I keep thinking about Walter Higgins," she said. "About what happened to him. What almost happened to me, if that forged bank record had gone unanswered a single day longer. It didn't. No. But it could have." Her voice caught, just slightly. "How many people has this county lost, Nathaniel, to men like Roland, and men like Voss, simply because nobody stood up in time?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know it stops being that many, starting today." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that had, somewhere in the last hour, stopped feeling heavy and started feeling instead like something close to peace. The weeks that followed moved fast in some ways, and painfully slow in others, the way weeks do, after something enormous has finally broken open. The water was restored, within days, the iron gate torn down, and hauled off by a work crew Nathaniel hired out of Bozeman, and Eleanor stood at the North Channel the afternoon it happened, watching the flow run clean, and full and correct down toward the lower fields for the first time in 2 years, and something in her chest eased, that she hadn't fully realized was still clenched. The criminal proceedings moved slower, the way such things always did. Statements taken. Record subpoenaed. The sheriff's office working, through Walter Higgins's buried ledger name by name, family by family, uncovering the full size of what Roland Ashby and Harlan Voss had built together across the better part of a decade. It was, the sheriff told Nathaniel plainly one afternoon, the largest such scheme the county had seen in his tenure, and it was going to take the better part of a year to fully untangle. Restitution came slower still. But it came. Eleanor spent those weeks doing the work she'd always done best. Organizing. Documenting. Making sure every family, whose name appeared in that buried ledger had a clear, careful accounting of what they'd lost, and what they were owed, so that when the courts finally moved, there would be no argument left for anyone to make. Walter Higgins wrote to her, eventually, once word of the hearing had traveled far enough to reach him. A short letter. Grateful, careful, still carrying the particular caution of a man who had once trusted the wrong assurance, and paid for it, with his livelihood. She wrote back, and told him Cedar Hollow's books needed a second hand now, if he wanted the position back, on whatever terms suited him. He came back within the month. It was late summer still, when the water started running clean again, and it was well into autumn, the aspens up along the ridge gone the color of old brass, before Roland Ashby's trial finally came around, and when it did it was not the drama the county had whispered it might be. He pled, in the end, rather than face the full weight of what 4 separate ranch families, and a small mountain of documentation could bring against him, and the sentence, when it landed, felt to Eleanor less like triumph, and more like a long exhale she'd been holding for 20 years, without fully knowing it. She did not attend every day of it. She attended enough. And on the last day, when it was finally, entirely over, she stood outside the courthouse in the thin autumn light, and found she felt something she hadn't expected to feel at all. Not joy exactly. Something quieter than that. Something like the particular relief of finally closing a ledger that had sat open, unbalanced, for 20 long years, and watching the final column come out clean. Harlan Voss's proceedings took longer, reaching further than Cedar Hollow alone, pulling in county officials, whose names Eleanor hadn't expected to see, a land assessor, it turned out, who'd been quietly paid to look the other way on certain filings for the better part of 5 years, a discovery that shook the county courthouse in ways Roland's trial alone never had. That case would run another year past the point where this particular story, Eleanor's story, had already found its own quiet resolution. But that was a different reckoning, for different people, and Eleanor found, watching it unfold, from a careful distance, that she was glad, simply, to have been the thread that finally pulled it all into the light. It was a Sunday evening in early winter, months after the hearing, months after the water had been restored, weeks now since Roland's sentence had been handed down, and the courthouse doors had closed behind that particular chapter for good, when Eleanor found herself back at the creek in the last hour before dark. Nathaniel was there. Of course he was there. Some things about a man stayed constant no matter what else shifted around him, and the creek at evening, she had come to understand, would always be his. She sat down on the flat rock. He moved over, the way he always did now, without being asked, the way people move for the people they've learned to make room for. For a while, neither of them spoke. The water moved, slower now with the first cold coming on, a thin skin of ice already forming at the edges, where the current ran shallow. The light didn't stretch long, and gold the way it had all summer. It came low, and pale now, a winter light, silver more than anything, catching the frost already silvering the grass along the bank. The last of the restitution filings went through today, she said finally. Mrs. Hargrove's sister gets her land assessment reviewed next month. Walter's settling back into the office like he never left. She looked at the water. It's strange, having quiet again. The real kind. Not the kind you're just waiting to have taken from you. Good strange? Or the other kind? I haven't decided yet. A small, tired smile. Ask me again in a year. He was quiet a moment, watching the water the way he always watched it, when something weighed on him. I've been thinking, he said, about something you told me. Back when you first learned about the ranch. About needing this to be your choice. Not something owed, not something built on obligation. I remember. I want to say it back to you now. Properly. He turned to look at her, and something in his face had gone very open, the careful distance he'd spent 30 years building finally, entirely, set down. Cedar Hollow is yours, as much as it's mine, Eleanor. Not because I'm offering it to you out of gratitude for what you did. Because you built half of what it is now, brick by brick, the same as I did 30 years ago, just faster, and with considerably more courage than I had at 32. She looked at him a long moment. That's a very large thing to say to a woman on a rock. I've had 30 years of practice not saying large things at all. Something almost like humor moved at the corner of his mouth. I'm trying to make up for lost time. She thought about her father's kitchen table, 20 years gone. About Thomas, and the years after, and the particular careful arithmetic she'd built her whole life around ever since. Never risking more than she could afford to lose. Never trusting a promise, until the numbers behind it had been checked 3 times over. And she thought about the man beside her now. About a man, who mended fences, and read by a creek, and had let her grieve beside him, without once making her carry the weight of, who he really was, until she was ready to hold it. I fell for the man, who fixed fences, she said slowly. Before I ever knew he owned the ground under them. I need you to understand that's who I chose, Nathaniel. Not Cedar Hollow. Not 30 years of careful ownership. The quiet man on this rock, who asked me how I was really doing, and then actually waited to hear the answer. That man, he said softly, is the same man sitting here right now. I know, she said. That's the whole point. He reached across the space between them, and took her hand, slow, careful, giving her every chance to pull away, if she wanted to. She didn't. They sat that way a long while, the water moving steady beside them, the low winter light fading, from silver into something closer to blue, the first stars starting to show, over the ridgeline, and somewhere behind them the ranch settled, into its evening rhythms, the sounds of a place, that had finally, after everything, found its footing on honest ground. I don't need a wedding under the cottonwoods, she said eventually, half to herself, half to him. I've done that once already, with a good man, and I buried him 2 winters ago now. I'm 58 years old, Nathaniel. I'm not looking to repeat every chapter of a life I've already lived. Then we won't repeat it, he said. We'll write whatever comes next, as its own thing entirely. What does that look like, to you? He thought about it a long while, the way he thought about most things. Slow. Careful. Giving the question its due weight, before he answered. 2 names on a deed, he said finally. Instead of 1. A ranch that finally belongs, on paper the way it always has in truth, to the 2 people, who fought hardest to save it. He looked at her. No ceremony required, unless you want one. Just the truth, written down properly, for once, with nothing hidden underneath it. Eleanor Wren looked out at the water a long moment, and something in her chest, the last of the old fear, the last 20-year-old grief, that had followed her, from a kitchen table in another state to a creek in Montana, finally, quietly, let go. I think, she said, I'd like that very much. The lawyer drew up the papers, within the month, and on a cold, bright morning deep in winter, snow already sitting thin and clean along the fence lines Nathaniel himself had built, Eleanor Wren signed her name beside Nathaniel Calloway's on the deed to Cedar Hollow Ranch. And this time, when she wrote her name down, there was no fear in her hand at all. Only the same steady, careful signature she'd built her whole life on. The signature of a woman who had learned, the hard way, twice over, exactly what it cost to look away from the truth, and had decided, both times, that the cost of looking away was always higher than the cost of looking straight at it. Walter Higgins kept the books alongside her now, the two of them working the ledgers together most mornings, and some afternoons Wyatt would come find her at the fence line the way she'd once found Nathaniel there, asking after some small detail of the ranch's operations, with the same careful thoughtfulness she'd first mistaken, all those months ago, for nothing more than a good hand's honest curiosity. Silas Boone still worked the tack room, slower now, but steady, and some evenings, when the work was done, Eleanor would find him there, and sit a while, and neither of them needed to say much of anything at all. Some understandings didn't require words. They only required time, and the both of them had finally, after everything, found enough of it to spare. And most evenings, even now, even with frost on the ground, and the water running slow, and silver under a thin skin of ice, Eleanor Wren walked down to the creek at the western edge of Cedar Hollow, her creek now, as much as his, and found Nathaniel Calloway sitting on the same flat rock he'd been sitting on the very first evening she'd ever seen him there. Boots off. Feet bare against the cold stone. Some book or another resting closed in his lap, because he'd stopped reading the moment he heard her coming. Room on the rock, he'd say, every time, the same words, no ceremony to them at all. And she would sit. And the water would move between them, patient and clean, and finally, entirely, running exactly where it was always meant to run.